there were 18 million eligible voters who stayed away from the polls. And that's potentially an enormous swing vote. If those 18 million voters were to decide to come and vote for an opposition party instead, one which really stands outside the ANC sphere, then you could have a change of power.
What is the National Democratic Revolution? Is it the pure and only motivating force behind what the ANC does? Are there other factors at play? What can the NDR and trying to understand it tell us about the various policies and ideas that the governing party, the ANC, implements? Joining me to discuss the NDR, to try and unpack at least some of its tentacles, its implications, its effects on the South African economy and society, is Dr. Anthea Jeffery from the Institute of Racial Relations. Anthea, a question around sort of economic growth, the general upliftment of quality of life, those sorts of things maybe that many take for granted that would always be there, but then not taking into consideration that you need the right ideas in place, the right policies, the right sort of environment for those things to occur. It's not a given. Prosperity isn't a given out there in nature. I think arguably poverty is the natural state of things, and one needs to create prosperity. It won't just be there forever and always, in all contexts. So in light of that sort of macro point, South Africa's low economic growth prospects, if we're lucky, we'll get 0.9% growth this year, according to the IMF, if one considers that growth really, and into the short to medium term. I mean, for anyone else, hearing those sorts of numbers and seeing how people's quality of life has declined in South Africa over the last 10 years, you would think there must be some change in terms of policy, in terms of where one gets the policies from, but also how you implement them, for example. But there doesn't seem to have been that particular break. So perhaps when people appeal to these ideas of prosperity, of quality of life, it's not the best way to try and understand why the ANC does what it does, because that's not the ultimate end.
Yeah, I think the ANC understands very well that you can't move from a free market capitalist society to a socialist one if the capitalist society is thriving. You know, if we had growth now of 5 or 6%, if we had unemployment below 10%, if living standards were clearly rising, education was functioning well, people would be more self-reliant. There would be a sense that they don't need the government. They can move ahead with their lives in any event, and almost no prospect in that environment of shifting to socialism. Why would anybody want to do it? So you need a real economic crisis from which the ANC can argue that socialism is the solution. So the ANC has a kind of perverse incentive to make it very difficult for the private sector to thrive, to cripple the economy, as it were. And one of the ways that you can do so is, in fact, by overloading the private sector with unrealistic obligations for which they don't have the resources to meet them. And the NHI would again be a classic example. You can overload private hospitals with obligations to take care of people who have to be treated for free at the time they present, and will only get back from the state so much as the ANC and the SACP decide to allow them, and which may therefore become bankrupt in the process. And so I think there's an assumption that the ANC must, as most people want, to see a thriving economy. But the ANC sees the thriving economy as far in the future. First, you must generate the economic crisis. Then you will move to socialism. Then you will move to utopia, in which all problems will be resolved and all needs will be taken care of. And perhaps it has an echo of, I think it was Nomvula Mokonyane said a number of years ago, it doesn't matter if the rand falls because we can pick it up again. It doesn't matter if the economy gets into crisis, because at the end we have the solution for it. But all the South Africans who are living through the crisis see it very differently. And of course, the promise of socialism, and it's an entirely false one. It's not going to be an efficient, wonderful system. It's going to be what every socialist system across the world has been: grossly inefficient, grossly corrupt, and grossly repressive. So But the ANC has a dream, and they're motivated by the dream. And so they keep on pursuing it despite all the evidence of failure along the way.
Anthea, I wanted to ask you a little bit about the possible effects of the NDR on civil society and freedom of speech, the sort of exchange of ideas. It might not be direct, it might not be in sort of one day, as it were, that the policies in that avenue are implemented to restrict the exchange of ideas. But do you think, as one heads on the path towards achieving the ultimate goal of the NDR, you can't necessarily, you as the person trying to implement the NDR, you can't really allow for the robust exchange of ideas, for criticism of your ideas, all those sorts of things? Do you think in trying to implement the NDR, one is going to see sort of increased efforts at depressing and pushing down on the work of civil society, of the media, of journalists, all that kind of thing, as a sort of either direct consequence or maybe a secondary effect of the NDR?
I think there is a risk of it. At the moment, I think we have, of course, a remarkably free media, but it's also a media, as I said a little while ago, that manages to ignore the NDR, even though this is the most important ideology and impetus that underpins all the ANC's policy decisions. If you want to understand South Africa since 1994, you need to understand the NDR. And yet the commentariat, as we said, is sleeping through the revolution and largely ignoring it. So in some ways, the ANC doesn't have to clamp down on the media because there are certain issues that they don't really give any attention to anyway. But there is a risk that the kinds of policies that are pending now will become will be put onto the statute book and will become increasingly repressive. We have the State Information Act from way back that was adopted but not actually brought into operation, that will enable an extraordinary degree of state information to be classified and put off limits. We have the criminalization of hate speech, which is pending now, a bill that is before Parliament, is proceeding through Parliament. And hate speech is extraordinarily widely defined. The Constitution indicates that certain speech, for example, that which incites violence, is not protected. That which really whips up hatred is not protected. But what the bill that we have now goes far beyond that. And it could again mean that all sorts of criticisms become off limits because people will be afraid of being arrested for hate speech and put in jail for up to 8 years. We also have pending new intelligence law, under which if anybody wanting to run an NGO, establish an NGO, will have to go through security vetting of a kind that it will be kept really confidential. So it will mean that people's private conversations will be monitored. There may be findings that people may not work in particular NGOs because they failed their security vetting. It's all a bit of a kind of an amorphous area. We also know that there are concerns being raised at the degree of surveillance that will be possible under a new law affecting RICA, the whole process of interception of communication, which is supposed to be controlled quite carefully, but mass surveillance may become possible under this law, and mass surveillance would not be adequately monitored. So there's straws in the wind at the moment, rather than a real clampdown. But we must remember that the ANC is intent on maintaining power. It is beginning to feel that power might be slipping away from it. It knows that it got 46% of the vote in the local government election in 2021, that in the last general election in 2019, though there were 10 million people that voted for the ANC, there were 18 million eligible voters who stayed away from the polls. And that's potentially an enormous swing vote. If those 18 million voters were to decide to come and vote for an opposition party instead, one which really stands outside the ANC sphere, then you could have a change of power. You could have the ANC voted out. So in this environment, the ANC is probably more likely to be looking to eliminate criticism which it finds uncomfortable and a risk to it.
Thank you very much for watching. We hope you enjoyed today's video. Let us know your thoughts in the comments below on the National Democratic Revolution, the policies and ideas of the ANC, and the effects thereof on South African society, as well as on the economy, as well as your day-to-day lives, your business dealings, etc., as well as what you think the prospects for the country are going forward. Until next time, this has been Chris Hutton for the Centre for Risk Analysis. Take care.